If you want to hang around for a second, and when I'm done, you can pull my door shut. But we're getting ready to start here any second. So I uploaded my presentation. I need to beat myself out.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's Northern Kentucky Forum. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU, one of the partners in the forum, along with our 3 public libraries in Boone, Kenton, and Campbell County. And we are committed to bringing you thought leaders in our community to discuss public issues. And we have a lot of variety of topics, but a special one this morning as we celebrate Earth Day. So good to be with you as we start Earth Day, which is having a lot. I know there's a lot of events in the community, but I'm glad to have you with us for this one. I remind you that one of our co-sponsors this morning is the Roebling Point Books and Coffee, right by the bridge in Covington. And by joining us this morning, you will get a coupon for a free cup of coffee at Roebling Point and 22% off on the book of your choice. 22 in the because this is the 22nd of April, Earth Day. So be sure and visit the bookstore, which, by the way, has a lot of excellent collection of books on environmental science and a lot of field guides to plants and fish and trail guides and so forth. So nice little place to go get your discount and a cup of coffee and celebrate Earth Day with your reading as well. So we are fortunate this morning to have Dr. Monty McGregor with us. Monty is a mussel biologist. He has a lab right at the forks of the Elkhorn outside of Frankfurt. And you can drive by and not realize what you're driving past, but it's a place where remarkable research is going on. I remember visiting once and Monty said you can go to Africa and see endangered species running around the savannah, but you can come here and I'll show you some endangered species that are being preserved as well, held out a petri dish with 2 little things that look like grains of sand, but they were in fact a rare mussel that his lab was working to restore and breed in the lab, I believe, and then take back to the stream so that these species are not lost. So should be an interesting morning, and we'll let Monty will talk, and we have time for Q&A. So just put your questions in the chat and we'll get to those toward the end. And Monty, welcome. Thanks for being with us.
It's good to be here, and hopefully everyone can hear me okay, and hopefully everyone's having a good morning, and hopefully getting back to some kind of normal. This is the new normal we have today, and unfortunately it's not the ideal normal, but it is what we have today. So I'm going to be talking today about freshwater mussels, and some of you may have not even heard much about them, and probably I'm going to show you some things that that maybe hopefully will amaze you about freshwater mussels, and other things that may surprise you. Some things you probably know a little bit about, and so we're going to go ahead and get started, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions about some of these kind of crazy things I'm going to show you today. So I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully everyone can see my screen. And can someone confirm that everybody is seeing everything okay?
All good.
All right. All right. So today I'm going to talk about the freshwater mussels in the Licking River system, and then kind of expand it to a little bit beyond that as well. For some of you that haven't met me, here's a picture of me in case my video is not linking and working. And just a little bit about myself. I'm a native of Western Kentucky. I have moved all around the country in different places, worked in Tennessee, Alabama, Virginia with freshwater mussels. I started working back in 1988 with freshwater mussels and fell in love with these animals, and I've continued to work with them the rest of my career. Just a little bit about myself on personal. I have a wife of 30-something years and 6 children. So that makes me a perfectly normal person having 6 children. I always like to say that, but people just like open their eyes and like, are you kidding me? Are you serious? But it's true. I have 6 children and I love all of them. And they're all unique and different. I would like to acknowledge a little bit of our staff. A lot of this work that I do is really dependent on a lot of other people and a lot of other organizations. We partner with lots of people, universities, private groups, to be able to get the work that we're due here at the center. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can get involved in helping us as well. We also have a lot of funding sources that help us do our work. Some of these are state wildlife grants, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants, Corps of Engineers, and other sources as well that we try to go after to be able to do a little bit more than we could if we didn't have those. So today I'm going to be talking about freshwater mussels. And most of you probably, when you think about freshwater mussels, you may just think of something like this, some shells that are pretty that you may have that you see laying on the riverbanks or lakes, but hopefully I will help you understand how really extraordinary they are and unique they are and sophisticated. Kentucky has always had a significance of use of mussels. Even the earliest Native Americans or the earliest scientists came to Kentucky to study these animals, and I'll talk a little bit about why they came here and what was so significant about Kentucky. But I want to talk a bit about a few first. Okay, so what about freshwater mussels? And so they're some of the first fishermen or fisherwomen, because it's actually the females that go fishing, and I want to show you how they do this. So this is a freshwater mussel that is having a lure that looks like a fish, and this one here is a very unique one that I saw that has like 3 eyes almost. So it's the only one I've ever seen like that, but it's pretty cool. And the fish will come along, see this, and strike at that lure, and its larvae, which I'll explain in a few minutes, will get infested onto the host, and I'll talk about how that works a little bit later. Lures come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and here's a different kind. Again, a lot of them are shaped like something the fish would eat. Like this one's shaped like a little darter or fish. Here's the mussel, by the way, at the bottom. And then the fleshy part that's moving is part of the mantle tissue that allows it to make this lure. Here's one of my favorite lures. This is called the catch ball. This is a really, really rare mussel. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but this one has these massive teeth that will grab a hold of the fish and clamp onto the fish's head, and then the lure is in the middle. It attracts the fish to come in and stick its nose in there and try to get a bite of something. So this thing you see moving here with the little tubercles is actually part of the mussel's mantle, and it wiggles it and tries to draw in the fish. And again, with those massive teeth, it tries to grab a hold of the fish. This species is only found in one place in North America, in Ohio, but we are working to restore it in other places. Now, here's another lure that you see in the upper right, and here's exactly what happens to the lure of the mussel is moving in the water. Fish comes along and sees that, and then strikes at that and gets a mouthful of larvae and allows the mussel to complete its life cycle. Mussels also had some of the first fishing worm lures. Now, here's one that actually lives in the Licking River. If you're ever out in the springtime and you're out in the water and you see these little red licking worms sticking out of a mussel, that's actually a lure to attract its host fish. Some of the mussels were also the first tools that people used. The Native Americans used these to make holes and to dig and things like that. Even the first people used the washboard kind of clean their clothes, kind of like the washboard you see at the bottom. Mussels also have a lot of interesting first names, like the rabbit's foot, the ring pink, the hill splitter, fanshell, and there's a lots more. We also have some of the first clothing items. These were buttons made from freshwater mussels in the early 1900s, and it was a pretty substantial resource that was used and collected to make buttons. And this happened all the way to about the 1940s, when plastic was kind of invented and took over a little bit of the production of these buttons. Also, the first not so safe methods were developed for collecting these animals. This is in the early 1900s, one of the first dive rigs, where this gas can was put on this guy's head, and this guy on this shanty boat would actually sit there and pump air down to them, and hopefully he trusted him enough to keep pumping, or he would run out of air. They did some crazy things. They would tie these huge rocks to themselves and then drop down to the bottom, hold their breath for 2 or 3 minutes, and then cut the rope, and up to the surface they go. Of course, a lot of them didn't make it, unfortunately. The button industry was pretty substantial back in the early 1900s. The Muscatine, Iowa was kind of the center in the country. And there are 40 button manufacturing industries alone in this city. And it was a pretty large industry. And their product was these buttons that people would buy, and they would promote them as freshwater mussel shells. And they had all kinds of colors to them and designs, and it was a big industry. There's some of the first jewelry mussels were pearls. What date back a long time ago. But the most recent pearls were cultured pearls, and you can see there's different colors, different shapes and sizes, and this was mostly done in the Far East, in Japan and China, and in that area of the country. And they basically would take a bead, put it inside of an oyster, and then a couple years later they would pull these little round pearls out. And we get the cultured pearl industry. This was a big industry that still is going on today, not as much as it used to, but it's a big industry in China. Here's an example how that's done again. The pearl is inserted into oyster, and then they hang them in these bags and then get them out in a couple of years. In fact, if you go to some of these places where you can buy oysters, sometimes they'll sell, you can buy yourself a pearl that they're making. In North America, there are several mussel species that were used in the pearl industries, and they would collect these even nowadays in states like Alabama and Arkansas. They're still collecting these mussel shells to make these pearls, and even some cases buttons, but mostly pearls. But anyway, back in the early 1900s, what happened is when there was a huge demand for these shells, there came an overharvest of native mussels. And that was a problem, because you can see these piles of mussel shells on the bank, and it would just basically deplete the mussel populations out in the wild. And so we started the trend toward imperilment. Mussels started to become rare and rare and more endangered. We didn't have the Endangered Species Act at the time, but they became so rare that the populations were almost depleted throughout the country. So these combined impacts led to some high levels of impairment with this mussel resource. And it also has contributed from other factors as well. There's exotic species, there's change of habitat and loss of habitat, like pollution and things like that. Dams were a big thing, where we changed the river to a lake, and it impacted the mussels quite a bit. And I'll talk about how it did that a little bit more in a minute. But you can just see from this list of all the dams we have in Kentucky, and there's a lot of them, in the year they were built, from back in the 1800s all the way to recently to 2020. Just on the Ohio River itself, there's several main stem river dams. All the little yellow marks on the Ohio River are all dams. So the average depth of the Ohio River used to be about 2 feet. Now it's about 25 feet. So we can see that the habitat has tremendously changed, and as a result, the mussel fauna has been changed as well. We also know water is pretty important, especially on this Earth Day. We talk about things that are important. You know, water, clean water in particular, is vital to all species, including ourselves. We have to have clean water in order to keep ourselves healthy. And it is also something that we see in this world today, is a lot of species that live in the water are becoming more and more imperiled, and we need to figure out what's going on with this. So just to give you a perspective a little bit, we think about water being so abundant, and it is abundant if you just look at the surface of the Earth. It covers a lot of the Earth's surface, about 71%. However, the freshwater component is very small. In fact, even though there's a large amount, 326 million trillion gallons, it's only really way less than 1% of the Earth's mass. You can see all the relative water on Earth in this little box to the lower right relative to the mass of the Earth. In fact, if you just look at the percentage of water relative to the types of water we have, 96% of the water is made up in ocean, seas, and bays, while only about way less than 1% is made up of freshwater, in our rivers in particular. So if we did this in the graphic standpoint, think of that big blue ball there as all the water on Earth. The medium-sized ball is more of the fresh waters, and then the little tiny speck, which I really increased the size of, is all the water in the Licking River. It's not much. A 550-foot, diameter ball would be all the water in the Licking River. So when you think of it in perspective like that, it's not really much. Well, anyway, the water we do have, though, fortunately, does produce a lot of different kinds of habitats, from streams to rivers to lakes, estuaries, and these are places where these animals live. Now, today we're going to be talking about mostly freshwater, in particular in North America. We're going to be talking about the Mississippi and Ohio River system. The Mississippi here in the blue, the Ohio in the red, and we're sitting right here in the heart of the Ohio River system in the Licking, there in Cincinnati. We have about 10 major rivers in Kentucky. The light blue here is the Licking. It flows from the southeast Kentucky north into the Ohio River, and has about 180 free-flowing river miles below Cave Run Lake all the way to the dam, and is a substantial resource for freshwater mussels, which I'll talk more about. So mussels, anyway, are invertebrates. They have a very complicated life cycle. I'll talk about them in a minute. And all these different components here, I'll discuss these each, but they are some of the rarest animals we have on the planet. And I'll talk about why that they're so rare. Well, first of all, they're a unique life cycle. Freshwater mussels, they have separate sexes. So the females will produce eggs that'll be fertilized by the males. And these eggs develop into this little larvae called a glaucidia, which you can see to the left. And this larvae has to come in contact with a host fish in order for them to complete their life cycle. Just kind of think of it in a way like a butterfly does. You have a butterfly, it lays an egg on a leaf, hatches out, turns into a caterpillar, and then eventually it'll reach the pupa stage where it'll turn back to a butterfly. So mussels kind of do something similar. The little pupa stage, so to speak, is on the fish. So without the host, the mussel can't complete that metamorphosis and turn into a juvenile. But once it does it on the fish, it stays on there for a few weeks at a time, it'll drop off, start its life as a juvenile mussel. 2 or 3, 4 years later, it'll reach reproductive age. And then some mussels, surprisingly, can live older than we are. I know some of the mussels that I've seen that are in their 60s, 70s, 80 years old, with the record one that I've seen is about 200 years old. But I'd say on average, 25 to 30 years is pretty common for mussels to live. So where are mussels in this world? So when we think of rare species, we always think of Africa or Australia or something, South America, the tropics. But for freshwater mussels, if we look around the world, just pay attention to the white here on the screen. The white here is where we have more than 80 species of freshwater mussels in any one location. So we can see that's only in the southeastern United States. So right here in Kentucky, in the heart of the southeastern United States, we have some of the greatest mussel diversity of anywhere in the world. So if we zoom in on North America a little bit, we can see Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee is the highest number of freshwater mussels, with well over 100 species in each one of those 3 states. And in Kentucky in particular, we have over 100 species. Now, where are these at in Kentucky? We can see these river systems have anywhere from 25 to 30 up to over 80 species of freshwater mussels. And we can see the Licking there on the right with 56 species. So again, it's the 3rd highest number of mussels in the country. And again, relative to the world, we have more than about anywhere else in the world just here in the state. Unfortunately, in the 105 species we have in Kentucky, we have 12 species that have gone extinct. That means they're no longer living on the planet, and we can't find them live anywhere. We also have 27 that are listed as federal endangered or threatened, meaning that they're heading toward extinction if we don't do something about it. We have an additional 46 species that are what we call species of greatest conservation need. Now, some of those are also endangered. But we have some that aren't endangered yet or threatened that are heading toward that status as well. We do think we have a lot of species that are doing pretty good in the state as well. Just to reflect how many we do have, we have about 35% of all the U.S. species here in the state. Anyway, with respect to the rare species, we've lost in particular one genus in particular, the Epioblasma. This is the scientific name of a freshwater mussel, and we have about 27 of these in the country, but 15 are already extirpated or extinct. We just have a few of these left in the state, and hopefully for some reason this species has been hit harder than anything else, but hopefully we can do something about it. Well, let's focus on the Licking River a little bit. We have about 56 species in the licking of freshwater mussels, 11 T&E species, one extinct mussel, a leaf shell. I'm sorry, one of the Epioblasmas. And then we have also 6 species that are federally endangered that were extirpated. And I'll talk about what that means were earlier, because we have actually added these mussels back to the river, and I'll talk about how we did that. The licking is also pretty rich in fish diversity, over 120 species roughly, with one endangered species that's been extirpated, the shovel-and sturgeon. And but anyway, the combination of the fish species and the mussels work together very well because they are linked together. So where's the licking? It's in southeastern Kentucky, flows north into the Cincinnati area, and again about 180 miles of free-flowing water below Cave Run Lake, all the way to the mouth there near the Cincinnati. One thing about the licking that's pretty amazing is that every riffle on the licking, and there's hundreds of them, support lots of freshwater mussels. So just imagine if every riffle was about the size of a football field, and in that football field there's about 50,000 mussels. Then we're talking about all the mussels in that particular area are filtering 250 metric tons or 500,000 pounds of silt per year. So just think of all the filtration capacity going on in the licking as a result of these freshwater mussels. Well, some common species you see in the licking. The upper left, you have the three ridge. The middle is the washboard, which I mentioned earlier. The maple leaf is down. The monkey face, is in the middle. The kidney shell, pocketbook, and there's all kinds of different species that we find that are fairly common. In fact, I would say most all the riffles in the licking have about 20 species of common mussels that you find at any one time. Here's the rare ones in the licking. We have some really comical names of these guys. The rabbit's foot, which is in the center right, the snuff box, the pink mucket, the sheep nose, and there's more and more of these things. But these are the rare ones that we used to not find in the licking, but some of these now that we do find because of the work that we're doing at the center. What does the licking look like at a normal site? You can see at the top top slide, top picture, you can see just they're a small riffle, shallow, with water willow bars, with rocks on the shoals. This is what we see throughout the Licking River, and this is the habitat where these mussels live inside these flowing water areas. One of the things about the licking we have is we have one of the most robust populations of the fan shell. And what I mean by robust is if we look at the fan shell population at several places in the licking, what we see is animals of all ages, of every size class. These animals live about 20 years, and I can find 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, all the way to 20-year-olds. That's good. We want to see that. It is probably the best population of the fan shell that we have anywhere in the world. It's second to none. So we want to make sure that the licking stays good for this species and others, because it is the heart of the fan shell population. So what are we doing about all this freshwater mussel impairment? And is there something that we can do to help them continue to improve and populations increase? And the timing is critical. Some of these animals are on their last leg. We're down to the last few. So timing is really important that we get in and step in and do something. So what we've got is a project on the licking to restore the river to its original fauna. Again, we have 1 extinct mussel and 7 extirpated. So what we want to do is develop some conservation areas. So we have these throughout the state, and Licking is one of them. So what we can do is we can look at all the red dots on this map. These are conservation zones that we want to do work with freshwater mussels. And these are probably the most significant areas where we have the most species. So we can see there's several areas in the Licking in the upper right where we have populations of the fanshell, for instance. So these are all good conservation areas for us to work. And a good example of something we can work with is like the cat's paw at the bottom right. This is a species that had the little teeth on it that I showed you earlier in the video. And we want to bring this animal back into the Licking as well as some of the other rare ones as well. So the way we do our conservation zones is we have monitoring stations across the state where we monitor populations of mussels every 5 years, where we do quantitative sampling. We go in and count numbers and look at size classes and year classes and all this stuff. And we want to make sure they're doing okay. So when we add animals to these populations, we can actually monitor them and see how well they're doing over time. So how we started this was back in 2002. I started with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'd already worked at another state resource agency where I'd started another facility similar to this, but I wanted to start something so we could actually work with the restoration and work with propagation and culture of these really rare animals. So the facility we started was in Frankfort, Kentucky, on the Kentucky River system in Elkhorn Creek. There's about 20 species in the watershed and about 50 something, almost 60 species in the watershed. So it was a good location, centrally located to the resource. It's close to the Licking, close to the Green, close to the Ohio, and it's a good central location to do some of this work. So we have some modern facilities such as a greenhouse. We have bioreactors to raise the food for mussels, which is freshwater algae. You can see the different kinds here. We've got 2 different kinds of greens on the right with a diatom, the brown one on the left in this fancy bioreactor. We're able to do some things that are pretty high tech to be able to work with these animals. Here's when we're going full speed. We have thousands of mussels in these little small trays, and they start off with the size of a grain of sand and end up being the size of a quarter before we release them. Well, how do we propagate mussels? First thing we do is we can go collect their host fish, and then we can put them together naturally and then let the fish go, or we can actually take larvae out of the mussel, put them on the fish artificially. We can actually then let the fish go, or we can actually hold the fish for a while and get the juveniles to come off and to try to rear them for a little while or let them go. And then finally, one of the last things we can do is we've developed a technique here that we've patterned after other folks, where we can actually skip the fish host using incubators and high-tech modern cell culture. We do that in the laboratory. We started doing that in vitro culture in 2004. I've been doing it for about 15, 17 years, somewhere around there. And as a result of that, we've been able to transform over 70 species of freshwater mussels without even using a host fish. So it's pretty remarkable. We have people from all over the world that come to see how we do this, and we help other states and other agencies do this project as well. So how do we do it? Is we put these larvae into a petri dish in an incubator, and then we add the liquid in and everything to get the juveniles. At that point, we will raise them at our facility for a few months, and then we take them to one of our branch facilities, which this is one of them located at Minor Clark Hatchery. And you can see there's about 3,000 mussels in the upper right in these little floating baskets. And we can put thousands of these mussels in these trays and let them grow for a few months before we release them. We also put them in these little floating baskets to kind of keep them separated a little bit better. We've been doing this for a few years. We also been partnering with Wolf Creek National Fish Hatchery down in Lake Cumberland, where we have these experimental cage cultures. We've been doing this since 2016. So we'll basically put either fish or juveniles in these little cages and then wait a few months. And then at the end of we take them out of the cages and we get stuff that looks like this. These rare mussels, like the upper right is the cat's paw. The upper left is the tan riffle shell, the Cumberland beans in the middle. These are all extremely rare animals. All of these found at only just a few places left in the world, sometimes even 1 or 2 riffles. So this is how rare animals that we're working with. The cat's paw in the upper right is only found in 1 place left in the North America, and I'll show you where that's at in a second. Well, Licking River, again, is pretty important resource for a lot of the freshwater mussels. And we have a large group of animals that live there. and we see young of lots of species, and that's what we want to see. So it's a perfect candidate for putting a lot of these mussels back. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in the licking with restoring some of these rare mussels. First, I want to talk about the endangered cat's paw. So the cat's paw used to be found in where all these black dot locations are on this map. That's the historic distribution. Now, some of these are 100-year-old records. It was thought to be extinct in the mid-90s, and then one population was found at this green star in Killbuck Creek in Ohio, and in the 90s, and then went back about 10 years later in the early 2006 and 7, and we couldn't find any. And so we thought, oh no, it's already gone. So several years later, 4, 5, 6 years of effort looking for this animal, we finally found some and started the propagation process in 2011 and 12. And as a result of that, it took us a few years to figure out how to raise this animal. But as a result, we have released several thousand of these animals at about 9 locations around the state and other parts of the country. And these are the yellow dots here. So we're trying to bring this animal back at its historic locations and places where we think they'll do okay. So here's what other things are going on in the licking. Again, the cat's paw was one of the first ones that we started as far as propagation, but then that led into other efforts. For instance, we've worked with the northern riffle shell and the club shell, and I'm going to talk about some of these here in a second about what we've done with all of those. We've also done some common species in the licking. Again, part of the work in the licking is to take some species that are maybe fairly rare but not endangered, and then try to get numbers of these. So here's an example we did in 2016. We were able to culture the slipper shell. We'll be able to raise and release over 8,000 of these back to locations throughout the river to boost its populations. Now, the first 3 really rare mussels that we put back in the licking was the northern riffle shell, the club shell, and the pink mucket. And we put these at these 7 locations marked here on the blue dots on the licking. We started this in 2012 all the way through 2016. And what we did is we partnered with the state of Pennsylvania, which is really the last remaining population of the northern riffle shell and the club shell, the northern riffle shell in particular. So they have a robust population up there. And as a result of a project that they were building, they were moving mussels, and we approached them and they approached us about basically, can we take, 15, 20, 30,000 of these adults and put them in throughout the licking and establish a new population from historic locations. So we partnered with them to do this work. It took a lot of effort, a lot of cooperation. We partnered with Environmental Science out of Ohio and partnered with the Fish and Wildlife Service to help us transport. We brought these mussels in fish trucks back to Kentucky, and we put them in the licking. And over the next few years, we monitor them, and they're doing great. So we have established a population of adults of these 2 species. Now, the pink mucket, the bottom species there, you can't really find enough animals to do that with, so we had to actually culture those. So we actually reared those and released thousands of these animals at 7 locations. So there's the first 3 species of the 7 extirpated that we put back in the licking. Here's an endangered pink mucket. It's very similar looking to the mucket. The upper right pitch photograph has the pink mucket on the right and the mucket on the left, and they're very similar. This one also has a lure. So if you're ever out in the licking and you see this little fish looking lure that's kind of pink looking, you might have a pink mucket there that you're seeing. So the pink mucket, we put those at some of the same sites that we put the northern riffle shell and the club shell. But again, we reared these and cultured these. And you can see in the middle slide there, we have a pink mucket where I circled with the blue. You can see how much it grew the first year that we put it out. And then the expanse past that is how much it grew the second year. So it's really doing well in the river. We have them marked with these little tags. You can see a number on these tags. So anytime we find one of these pink muckets in the wild, it'll have a little number on it and tags. We can see when we put it out and how big it's gotten and things like that. It's easy for us to track it. We couldn't have done this without help from our Northern Kentucky partners at Thomas More University, and some other folks up in the Cincinnati area helped us actually release these animals. You can see it took a good crew of folks to put these out and tag these animals and all this stuff. And it was a large effort that we did to be able to get this species back. Again, this is the northern riffle shell and the club shell. In 2016, we took some mussels from the green, the rough pig toe, and the rabbit's foot, and we released those at 3 locations into the licking to see how well they're doing. We're still working on the next phase of this species, and that's to culture and propagation to get more of these animals. They seem to be doing okay as well. So we've got hopes that these two species can make it as well. And here's again the rough pig toe and the rabbit's foot. The last one we did of all the ones that were extirpated was the red bean, and we had a unique opportunity to test a few of these animals in 2019, and then even 2020 in the pandemic, we were able to bring in a few thousand of these animals and put them into the green and licking at 3 sites, one of the 3 sites of the 7 sites we have, and hopefully these animals will do really well. And we partnered with some other organizations like the Nature Conservancy to help us so we can monitor these over time. So you can see the lower left photograph of me putting in a red bean into the licking in 2020. So how do we find these animals once that we've been out and we're looking around for them? We have some of these animals marked with what we call this little pit tag, and this is a little tag that sends out has a radio frequency that we can pick up with this wand. It's kind of like a metal detector. So we'll move this tag reader across the bottom of the river, and it'll pick up this individual unique tag that you see in the middle that I've got marked, and then we can find these much easier. So it's hard to find if you think about it. Throw about 100 quarters out into a riffle and go out and try to find them next year. So it'd be really difficult if we didn't have some way to zero it in on these, and this is how we do it. So just kind of a summary a little bit about Licking River and conservation. We can see we have over 105 species in Kentucky. We still think we have about 80 something species that we can actually find live in the state. However, some of these are federal listed as threatened and endangered. We're working with lots of species now, 20, 25 species at a time, typically in a year. And we've augmented a lot of species in the licking, over 10 species. We've translocated some animals from other places, and we've released thousands into the licking as a result of our restoration efforts. We propagate a lot of mussels here at our center. Some of these go to other river systems and even some out of state. We propagated a lot either using the fish or using in vitro culture. And as a result of some of this, we're doing some pretty amazing work that we're able to share our techniques and methods with and help other labs get started around the country. So here's just an example of some of the mussels that we've raised over the years. And these are all juveniles that we've cultured. And it's pretty amazing that we can say that, you know, there's not many species that we haven't been able to work with, even the rarest of the rarest. So with that, I think I'm going to take any questions that you might have. And I think we've got plenty of time for that.
Dr. McGregor, thank you very much. As you said at the beginning, times are not quite normal, but if they were, you'd hear us all applauding. So thanks for the presentation. Do have a few questions and I'd like to get to and remind the audience, if you put them in the Q&A, we'll watch for them. One is, at one point you were talking about the age of mussels, and we have a question about how do you know the age of a mussel?
Well, freshwater mussels have annulus rings that they lay down, similar, kind of like a tree. So the difference is they go only in one direction. So if you start at the top of the mussel where it's kind of old, then you can actually count the rings. I may have one that I can show you that. Here's one. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but if you can see, here's the rings. There's 2, 3, 4, 5, and you can just count all the way down to this one's about 8 years old. So it's very similar to the way you do. You start at the top where it's kind of eroded and start counting each one of these little rings, and that's how you can tell how old they are.
Thank you. We also have a question. Another of our streams in northern Kentucky is the Gunpowder Creek, where your colleagues at Fish and Wildlife are now stocking it with trout. And so we have a question about mussels in the questioner observes that there used to be a significant number of mussels in Gunpowder Creek. Wonder what the situation is now.
Well, typically some of the tributaries, the smaller ones, don't support as many mussels as the main stem, and it's mostly a temperature fish population issue. So some of the tributaries, you know, again, may only support a few species, and depending on where it's at and the fish fauna, that really determines what's there. you don't have the same, maybe there's 8 or 10 species you might find that are more small stream species, but you do have some issues with, some of the tributaries having some pollution issues, erosion issues, and things like that. This is anywhere in the country, and sometimes that will affect the fish fauna that's there. But some of the tribs still have some substantial population. So it's one of these things that you might have a place or two in the river that maybe has had some problems, some development, but other places might still be okay with that species. But you're not going to find the numbers in the tribs that you're going to find in the main stem for sure.
Well, a little bit of a follow-up on that, given that the issue is, I guess, the water quality in the stream, but you were talking about the filtering properties of a mussel. What are they filtering generally? The silt, and what happens to that solid as it's filtered through?
The mussels eat a couple different things. They'll eat organic material, so like broken down leaves and plants and things like that. But they also eat a lot of algae, diatoms and things like that, but also bacteria. So mussels are very helpful to us. So what they do is they will filter everything that's in the water, regardless of what it is, and they'll pick out the stuff that they want and dump the rest onto the bottom. So they're really efficient at taking and moving suspended particles out of the water and selecting what they want. Sometimes that's depending on the time of year, what species they're eating, and how much flooding has happened is really depending on what they're actually pulling out of the water. But basically anything in the water, they're going to be pulling out, and they're going to be eating the algae, the bacteria, and the organic material.
Thank you. Question, can citizens acquire rare mussels and deposit them in private streams?
No, you're not allowed to take freshwater mussels and collect those without a scientific or educational collecting permit. The regulations allow you, for instance, to pick up and have 6 in your personal possession. So let's say you're out walking around and you see a pretty shell and you want to keep it and put it on your shelf. You're allowed to do that as long as it's not an endangered species. So you have to know if it's endangered or not. If you're questioning about whether it's endangered, you should probably just leave it there. But you're not allowed to collect them and use them for bait or anything like that. Again, it's because we have such a rare resource that we have that restrictions throughout the state.
So suppose you come across a tagged mussel. Does it help to report it? And if so, where should we report it?
If you happen to see a tag mussel for some reason, the easiest thing is, everyone has these smartphones in more of these days. You can just take a picture of it and send it straight to me. And I would be the one that probably tagged it in the first place, and be the one most interested in where you found it and why you found it there. So sometimes what will happen is our tag mussels, we have hundreds and thousands of them out there. So sometimes the muskrats get them and put them up on the bank, and people will find the tag mussel and they're curious about it. And so sometimes they'll send me a picture of it, and then I'll tell them what it is and when it was tagged and how it got there and why it probably got put on the bank, because the muskrat probably ate it for dinner. So that's usually what we'll do. But basically just report that straight to me, or you can call our headquarters office and give them the information and they'll get it to me.
You talked, I think it was the cat's paw mussel, but about a species that's thought to be extinct and then discovered. And you mentioned that there are a number that are extinct now. What are the chances that extinct species will be discovered as still with us and have a chance at restoration?
Probably not very good. Most of the species that are extinct, the last known individuals that were found were back probably in the early 1900s, even the mid 1800s. So, they've been gone a long time. There was a lot of extinction that happened around 1900 or so, when we have a lot of changes to the rivers. And so the chance of finding one is pretty low. It's very possible that, there could be a population out there, something that we haven't seen in 30 or 40 years that we're maybe calling extinct, that might be around. But the chance of finding that is pretty low. I wish there was more of that kind of case, but again, one of the most popular places to find rare animals were in the Ohio River at Cincinnati. So, what's the chance of someone wading around in the Ohio River right now is probably pretty low. So you've got to get, high-tech scuba gear and sophisticated helmets and to be able to even get in the river. And so a lot of them were in those locations. Now, finding a new population of something that's rare is very likely. We do have some new species that we're finding as a result of genetic work that's being done. So we have, let's say we have a species that in the green, it looks something similar to the one in the licking, and we're finding out through genetics that actually they're different. So maybe we might have a new species that arise because we split one from two different ones. So we do see that occasionally. We may have even a new species or two that show up in the licking as a result of splitting a species from another place. But typically the one we have in the licking is just going to get a new name. It's not going to be something new that shows up. Now, there are species that can show up. We have the bank climber, which is a species that used to be not even present in all of Kentucky. And then about 50, 60 years ago, it started showing up as a result of moving around from other river systems. And so now it's really common in the lower Tennessee and then starting to move up the Ohio River. So probably in 20 years or so, we might see a species show up in the licking that's moving up the Ohio River from downstream, because that species is more adapted to lakes and rivers than the rivers. And it's using those fish species that live in the Ohio River where they weren't there in the past. So we are seeing a little bit of that. So we might have a species or two that come in that maybe is not in the river system, but it's still present around other places in the country.
The next question is more of a statement, but I'll try to turn it a little bit into a question. It's from the Little Miami Conservancy, and it says, "Bravo, Monte. We have lost most of our mussels in the Little Miami here in the Southwest Ohio. The Little Miami Conservancy looks forward to working with you to devise a conservation restoration plan to bring back these amazing animals." I can't tell from that, and perhaps you can tell us, are you working with the Little Miami group now, or is this an opportunity that has emerged this morning?
We haven't worked with that group. We do work with the state of Ohio. Some we work with a partner at the Columbus Zoo. So we actually have a facility at the Columbus Zoo that actually does some propagation work for Ohio. The person that was over that, unfortunately, he died of esophageal cancer a couple of years ago. And so, but he has other people there that took over his work. And but we work and we're willing to work with any partners that want to work with us. And just because we have a river separating us doesn't mean that we can't. And we do work with other states. We have partners right now with Pennsylvania, with Virginia, West Virginia, Indiana, Tennessee, that we're working with right now. And so we go beyond Kentucky, and we work primarily anywhere in the Ohio River system. So any partners that want to do some conservation work with mussels, just contact me directly, and I'll help them with developing conservation plans and then approach to how you can move forward with restoration of your river system. I'll do that quite a bit.
Thank you. With question, I assume that mussel shells are susceptible to acidification too, like ocean animals. Are rivers acidifying due to climate change as well? And if so, is that affecting mussel shell development?
That's a great question. Typically, mussels live in very hard water systems. So they're dependent on calcium levels to be high enough to allow them to form their shells. So we actually have some of the hardest water in the country in Kentucky. The licking is very rich in limestone. And so, species that live in limestone rich areas aren't as affected by acid rain as much as species like, for instance, that live in the Smoky Mountains. Smoky Mountains is a big problem because you have, high elevation rain events that are dropping the pH down to 3 or 4. In the river systems there, the small streams and rivers will go, they'll go from 7.2 pH all the way down to 3 during a rain event. Now, we don't see those kind of changes in the licking because it's highly buffered with calcium carbonate, rich in limestone. So it's got a little bit of protection from that. That doesn't mean we can't have a spill event that occurs. Let's say a truck carrying ammonia or zinc or something that would cause a real acid pulse could spill and cause an acid pulse for a low acid event for a little while, and that could cause a temporary issue. But it's from natural acid rain, it's pretty protected. Again, the licking, there are other streams and stuff. Now the tributaries might be affected a little more than the main stem, but typically areas that are well buffered don't have as much impact from acid rain as areas that maybe aren't as well buffered, like a small stream in the southeastern plateau in the Cumberland River system, for instance. It would be affected a lot more.
A couple of questions. I think people are kind of intrigued by the whole propagation cycle and the host fish thing. One question is when mussel, the larva attached to the fish, what's the effect on the fish, if any?
Well, in the wild, it's a very rare event. I mean, just think about it. You know, take a salt shaker out and intentionally try to get some salt on a fish. Do the best you can with it. It's going to be very hard. So the mussel, who can't see, is trying to do that with no vision and sensing anything that touches. So if you go up and you just hit a mussel with your finger, it's going to squirt larvae out thinking that's a fish. And so the probability of them getting on a fish is very, very low. Now, the ones that have all the lures have an increased probability. So the ones that are bringing their fish in, attracting that fish, you know, they're going to, even the ones that have the teeth on them, the capture, they're going to have a pretty good success. If they can capture that fish, they're going to be successful at putting larvae onto the fish. Now, just because they release them into the water in close proximity doesn't mean they all contact the fish. So as a result of that, usually I never see over infested fish. So there's just a few that land on the fish, and most of the time the fish don't even know they're there. They do not harm the fish at all. Now, in artificial environment like we have at our hatchery, yes, I can put 5,000 on one fish and it probably will kill the fish. So I try not to do that as well. But I know the limits that I can put on a fish without killing it. I've never seen anywhere close to that in the wild. And, you know, just one or two, maybe a dozen that you see on a native fish is about all you'll ever see. And the fish, again, you know, this is how the mussels move up and down the river. The larvae will get on the fish. And then 3 or 4 weeks later, the fish may be 2 or 3 miles away, and then the mussel drops off. So this is how they move up and down the river. And it's very, very harmless to the fish. In fact, the mussels also create a great environment, clean water, habitat for spawning on the bottom, and allow the fish, when the fish are first hatched, to have a place of refugia. So they really work together to help each other out in the river systems. And as a result of that, you know, it's kind of a commensalence relationship. They work together and are not harmed. Either one of them are harmed by this.
Yeah, staying on that subject, the question is, are the relationship between mussel and the host unique to a specific fish? Do some species of mussels like work with one kind of host fish, or are we talking darters or bass or everything, or what's that look like?
It's a very complicated web. So just imagine 120 species of fish and 105 species of mussels, and they all have their own special interesting things. Like, for instance, the brown hickory nut in the licking, we found over the last few years that it really likes to use the sand darter. And so when we found out that the host was a sand darter, and there's 4 or 5 other species of darters that it uses, we started looking for sand darters. And when we started looking for sand darters, we started finding the brown hickory nut. So they are very closely linked, and most mussels can use 3 or 4 species, but typically in each river system, there's 1 or 2 species of fish that they really go after, and it varies. Some mussels, like the pocketbook, will use bass. Some mussels, like some of the maple leafs, use catfish. Other ones use darters, minnows, suckers, drum. I mean, it really varies, and it's something that we're still learning a lot about. We don't know all the host fish relationships at this point, but we every year test new species to try to figure out that relationship a little bit better.
Shifting gears a little, a question, when you mentioned that there's 50,000 mussels in a riffle, what what diversity is in that sample of 50,000? What's most common? What are they equal? Are there kind of minor representations of rare things? What's a sample of 50,000 look like?
That's a good question. Typically what I see is in that population, let's say I'll see about 30 species. And so maybe 8 or 9 species make up 90% of the numbers. So 10% of the numbers are made up by, 10 to 15 species. So that doesn't mean that the ones that are rare don't have decent numbers. It just means that 90% of them are made up by 8 and they make up the bulk. So let me give you an example. Let's say there's, out of 50,000, you might have 10,000 of one species. and 4,000 of species 2, 3, 4, and 5, and maybe 1,000 or 2 of the next 3. And then you start dropping off, you might get 300 or 400, you know, of some of the rare ones. And then the very, very rare ones, you might only have 1 or 2. So maybe out of that 30 species, there might be 5 or 6, 7 species that there's only 2 or 3, 4 animals in that population. And that's pretty normal. But what happens is if you go upstream 20 miles, you might see that one that was only represented by 2 or 3 animals being 200 or 300 now. So each little area is so unique and different that we need to protect all these areas, because we don't know yet exactly where the rare ones are doing really well. So like in one place in the Licking, the most common thing is the fan shell. There's 50,000 of the fan shell in one place. And so there's also 20,000 of muckets and 10,000 of this other species, and there's 250,000 mussels in this area. And it's pretty amazing, you know, get in an area that's 3 foot by 3 foot, we might get 50 per square meter. So in one area, and I do this all the time, and it's sad that we can't do this, you know, now with COVID, but basically I can go out in the Licking and pop my knees down on the ground and stick my hand in the water and not move from that spot and pick up 50 to 75 animals in 15 minutes. And so there's not many places in the world that I can do that. And so fortunately for the Licking, it's one of these places that there's a lot of mussels and there's a lot of abundance, a lot of species. One particular area will have 10 or 15 species and 50 animals. And I'm talking about areas that I can just reach from not moving. So it's a pretty amazing place. Now, other areas around the country, you might spend an hour and not find 1 or 2 mussels. So there's a lot of places that have a lot of problems, and the populations have declined to almost nothing. Even some places, the populations have been eliminated. So we're studying that all around the country right now, and like trying to figure out, why does this one river system not have any mussels left in it when it used to be a lot? And so we're trying to learn that information and trying to figure out why and reverse those trends.
Next question is, do you believe there is a role for environmental DNA in investigating and exploring for new streams and sites to begin restocking? I'm not sure what DNA means in that reference, but perhaps a regulatory agency.
Yeah, environmental DNA is actually where we can actually go out and take a sample of water out of the river and then analyze that sample to see if the DNA matches any of the mussels that are there. So what we do with that is, for instance, let's say we're looking for a rare mussel in the Licking and we don't know where they're at. So what we could do is we could go in and we could start taking a sample of water at every river mile for, let's say, 50 miles. And then all of a sudden we pick up DNA. And so what that does is helps us a little bit focus in on where that tissue is coming from. Now, if we go to a point and we don't see it anymore, then we know that those mussels are probably from there downstream somewhere. So it's a new technique that's just been around for a few years. There's a professor up in northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area that we're working with, and he's developed these markers for eDNA, and his data is very good. He actually came to my lab, sampled over 75 different species of mussels, and then put them in this computer system with DNA and spit out and told me what I had based on data from other places and stuff. And he was pretty accurate. So I think this method is really good. It can be hit and miss. I mean, just imagine you're sampling a needle in a haystack. In this case, you're sampling even a needle in a haystack the size of the river. And but it does work. And there's still some issues with that, but it is getting more and more advanced in that analysis and how we're doing that. And but it's high tech the way we're doing science anymore to find these rare mussels. We're using eDNA and DNA and all kinds of new techniques.
Thank you. Illuminating question and answer. Appreciate that. What about invasive mussels? Are they affecting native populations, and what areas are most affected?
The main 2 invasive mussels we have are Asian clam. It is present all throughout the Licking and throughout most of all the state. We are seeing in some places where that species is causing some problems with native mussels. It's typically in areas where you have nutrient poor streams, where you have a little bit of pollution, because they're a little more pollution tolerant. They don't seem to be causing so much problems in the Licking because we have abundant food resources and things like that. However, the other species that we do have a problem with, and not necessarily in the Licking, but in the state, is the zebra mussel. It typically only lives in there where there's barge traffic. So it's not going to get in the Licking typically because we don't have any barges that move up and down. And it has a little bit different life cycle. It doesn't use a fish hose, so it can't really get on a fish and move up the river. But we do see problems with those in mainly in the Ohio River, the lower Tennessee, the Cumberland, where we have barge traffic. It's not been the problem we thought that we'd see. They came in about 1990, 91, somewhere around there. But they are a problem in the Ohio River. They haven't wiped out a mussel population that I've seen in the state. So hopefully they won't cause as much problem. They tend to cycle each year. Some years there'll be a lot of them, and then the next year they're almost gone, and then 3 years later they'll be abundant again. So they really are up and down, and we're not sure exactly what regulates their population so much, but we think that there's a lot of things that could be contributing to that. But typically they're not going to get in the licking. Typically a flowing water stream that doesn't have regulation and it's got shallow water, it gets flooding. That's just conducive to native mussels, but not to the zebra mussels. So we're fortunate that we don't have any dams and things, because that would harbor habitat for the zebra mussel and could cause more problems.
And a follow-up, a couple, you've addressed some of what's been asked in the Q&A about zebra mussels, but one specific question point says that zebra mussels in the Ohio filter the water in a good year, cleaning the water of edible algae. How effective are licking mussels in removing E. coli downstream from a point source?
Again, I had that slide earlier to show, how much filtration capacity these animals have. And they, if you have a good mussel bed with thousands of little tiny pumps out there pumping water, they're pretty effective at moving, that material out of the water. However, the densities probably, 150 years ago were 10 times the amount they are now. So, we've actually removed the filtration capacity to some extent, when we developed areas and changed the rivers. So they used to be, like for instance, on the Ohio River, I've seen reports back in the 1800s where people could walk across the Ohio River on mussel beds. It was a hard surface all the way across, and we just don't see those kind of numbers anymore. So I think the capacity for filtration can be increased by increasing the number of mussels we have. And the more we have out there, the more filtration we have capacity, and the better and cleaner our rivers get.
The species that you reintroduced in the Licking River, are they reproducing in the river naturally?
Well, it takes them several years before they reach reproductive age, but yes, they are reproducing. Some of the ones we put in now, we've had them in long enough that we're seeing, for instance, gravid or pregnant females. It takes even longer. They need to be 3 or 4 years old before we typically find them. So hopefully in the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, we'll start seeing young animals from our efforts that we put in, but it's just a little bit early right now for that. But yes, they are reproducing. They usually reproduce at year 2 and 3. So we put them in 2016, 17. So we're already seeing some of the reproduction taking place, but that doesn't mean that there's young present yet, because we need more numbers of the adults. We need 4,000 of them at a site to get, recruitment occurring, which is young into the population. And we're getting there. It'll just take us a few years.
We're just about out of time, but a couple of more questions. One, you talked about the fish moving the species, carrying the eggs downstream, but are there other ways that mussels travel? Does flooding cause them to travel?
Typically, no. Typically mussels can, if I put a mussel that's the size of a quarter to a softball size out in a riffle, and we have the most, highest level flooding, I can go back and that mussel's probably in the same spot it was in, when I put it out there. Not to say that they can't get moved a little bit, but typically they don't move around a lot. They typically stay where I put them. I go back to, I've monitored populations before, during, before and after flooding, even major flooding, and the population seems to not be changed. So, I think what it does is affect the fish that are holding the larvae. That might move them downstream a little bit more and readjust those, but the mussels tend to stay where they're at.
We, because we're in a river community, we hear from time to time about harmful algae blooms. Are those damaging to the mussel populations?
They can be. Typically, your harmful algae blooms occur in lakes and not so much in the rivers. You can have exceptionally years where you have, let's say you have extended periods of drought, which might affect the water quality a little bit, and it might elevate the temperatures and harbor certain kind of algae. But the next time we have a flood event or a rain event, it typically restructures that community. So, the more natural the rivers are, the more they're up and down, the less likely you're going to see that toxic algae, which you see, it's mostly a blue-green algae that you're talking about. And they typically can occur a lot more in lakes, in confined areas, let's say near habitat, let's say sewage treatment plants or something that's maybe releasing a different kind of water quality than the natural river streams would. So some of the areas like that, again, you're more likely to see something like that in Ohio River where you have, altered habitat than you would in like the licking. I'm not saying it can't happen, but most of the time that I see them, it's in a lake where you have like a spill, and then all of a sudden a species gets established, the conditions are just right, and then it's there, and then the mussels would filter it. But I haven't seen that in the licking. I'm not saying it can't happen, but probably it's not as much of a risk in the main stem licking as it would be in other areas.
Quickly, Rich Kogan at the Ohio River Foundation observes, "We greatly appreciate our partnership with you and your team in enabling us to provide mussels in the classroom program to thousands of students in the region. In our restoration, we are receiving questions about population of mussels in wetlands. Are there any such species?"
Typically, wetlands are isolated from rivers, and they are mostly different kinds of habitat. Most wetlands tend to have more acidic water, which would basically erode the shells. So you don't find a lot of mussels in wetlands. Now, if you go into the Mississippi River floodplain, where you have kind of a semi-wetland that's always there, that's got connection to the river, you might see some mussels in some places like that. But if you just go out to an isolated wetland away from a river system, you're not going to find typically a lot of fish, or you're not going to find a lot of mussels because the habitat is not the same. There's a lot of anoxic, low oxygen areas in those wetlands near the benthic surface where the mussels would live, and mussels need a lot of oxygen. So typically wetlands aren't really mussel habitat.
One last question, if we could, just you talked about some of the fun and unusual names that the mussels have, and I'm wondering, in your career in studying mussels, have you discovered a species and been able to name it? And if so, how'd you pick a name?
Well, I haven't named any mussels. That most all the names of the mussels were done back in the 1820s. So there's been some name changes, and that happens quite a bit these days, but there's really not been any new species discovered of mussels for that to happen. Now, if a name ever happened, it would be something where we split a species from one group of animals into 3 or 4, and then that's a possibility. But I do have some friends that have had species named after them. Steve Alstead had one named after him, Alstead Eye. And that's because of a species he found down in the Duck River in Tennessee. But I haven't had any species named after me yet. So.
All right. Well, Dr. McGregor, thank you very much for being with us. One of the things that I notice when we have a forum is what our enrollment attendance is at the beginning and the end, and people have stuck with this. There's clearly a lot of interest, and I think people have enjoyed starting Earth Day this way this morning. I remind everybody that you will get an email from us for attending today that gives you access, provides you with a coupon for a free cup of coffee and 22% off on a book at the Roebling Point Books and Coffee Shop, which is in Covington, right by the Roebling Bridge. So stop by and use that. And we appreciate the shop's sponsorship this morning. We will have our next forum next Tuesday evening. It's first of 2 forums in which we are looking at the impact of COVID on arts in our community, and we'll start with a look at the performing arts. So please register and join us for that forum, and we are planning a busy 2021 throughout, so stay with us as we visit a variety of topics in the coming months. I also want to let you know that if you want to find a way to support the important work that Monty has talked about today. There is a vehicle for that in the state, as Kentucky Wild is a way to make a contribution to conservation efforts in the state. Relatively new program, and membership levels, I think, start at $25 and go up. Dr. McGregor, say a word about the value of this.
Well, we've been able to get some funding as a result of this for some specialized equipment. We were able to get, for instance, algae centrifuge to be able to help us concentrate. That's about an $8,000 piece of equipment. So we're able to get a few things like that as a result of some of these. One thing about Kentucky Wild is if you join at a higher level, we do have like events where you can basically come out and help us on particular things. And it's kind of like a event to highlight some of our top sponsors, but you also, anyone that joins has the capability of getting in kind of a drawing, so to speak, and then can come out and help us. And again, you know, even though $25 seems like a lot, it really goes a long way to helping us. We've used it for nets for songbirds, and we've gotten bird boxes and in the agency, and fortunately for us, we've been able to get, like, say, some chillers for some of our fish tanks. We've gotten algae culture devices, and so we've been able to use some of this funds to get some gear that we haven't been able to get otherwise.
Well, thank you for being with us, audience. Thanks for being with us, and we'll let you get on with the day, but it's been enlightening to be with you, Dr. McGregor. Thank you so much, and good day, everyone.
All right, y'all have a good day.